Book 1, Chapter 6 of The Clansman, an historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan by Thomas Dixon, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Michelle Fry. Chapter 6. The Assassination. Elsie called in the afternoon at the Camerons' lodgings, radiant with pride, accompanied by her brother. Captain Phil Stoneman, athletic, bronzed, a veteran of 2 years' service, dressed in his full uniform, was the ideal soldier, and yet he had never loved war. He was bubbling over with quiet joy that the end had come and he could soon return to a rational life. Inheriting his mother's temperament, he was generous, enterprising, quick, intelligent, modest, and ambitious. War had seemed to him a horrible tragedy from the first. He had early learned to respect a brave foe, and bitterness had long since melted out of his heart. He had laughed at his father's harsh ideas of Southern life gained as a politician, and while loyal to him after a boy's fashion, he took no stock in his radical program. The father, colossal egotist that he was, heard Phil's protests with mild amusement and quiet pride in his independence, for he loved this boy with deep tenderness. Phil had been touched by the story of Ben's narrow escape, and was anxious to show his mother and sister every courtesy possible, in part atonement for the wrong he felt had been done them. He was timid with girls, and yet he wished to give Margaret a cordial greeting for Elsie's sake. He was not prepared for the shock the first appearance of the Southern girl gave him. When the stately figure swept through the door to greet him, her black eyes sparkling with welcome, her voice low and tender with genuine feeling, he caught his breath in surprise. Elsie noted his confusion with amusement and said, "I must go to the hospital for a little work. Now, Phil, I'll meet you at the door at 8 o'clock. "I'll not forget," he answered abstractedly, watching Margaret intently as she walked with Elsie to the door. He saw that her dress was of coarse, unbleached cotton, dyed with the juice of walnut hulls and set with wooden hand-made buttons. The story these things told of war and want was eloquent, yet she wore them with unconscious dignity. She had not a pin or brooch or piece of jewelry. Everything about her was plain and smooth, graceful and gracious. Her face was large, the lovely oval type, and her luxuriant hair, parted in the middle, fell downward in 2 great waves. Tall, stately, handsome, her dark, rare Southern beauty full of subtle languor and indolent grace, she was, to Phil, a revelation. The coarse black dress that clung closely to her figure seemed alive when she moved, vital with her beauty. The musical cadences of her voice were vibrant with feeling, sweet, tender, and homelike. And the odor of the rose she wore pinned low on her breast, he could swear it was the perfume of her breath. Lingering in her eyes and echoing in the tones of her voice, he caught the shadowy memory of tears for the loved and lost that gave a strange pathos and haunting charm to her youth. She had returned quickly and was talking at ease with him. "I'm not going to tell you, Captain Stoneman, that I hope to be a sister to you. You have already made yourself my brother in what you did for Ben." "Nothing, I assure you, Miss Cameron, that any soldier wouldn't do for a brave foe." "Perhaps, but when the foe happens to be an only brother, my chum and playmate, brave and generous, whom I've worshipped as my beau ideal man, why, you know I must thank you for taking him in your arms that day. May I again?" Phil felt the soft, warm hand clasp his, while the black eyes sparkled and glowed their friendly message. He murmured something incoherently, looked at Margaret as if in a spell, and forgot to let her hand go. She laughed at last, and he blushed and dropped it as though it were a live coal. "I was about to forget, Miss Cameron. I wish to take you to the theater tonight, if you will go." "To the theater?" "Yes, it's to be an occasion, Elsie tells me. Laura Keene's last appearance in Our American Cousin, and her 1000th performance of the play. She played it in Chicago at McVicker's when the president was first nominated to hundreds of the delegates who voted for him. He is to be present tonight, so the Evening Star has announced, and General and Mrs. Grant with him. It will be the opportunity of your life to see these famous men. Besides, I wish you to see the city illuminated on the way. Margaret hesitated. I should like to go, she said with some confusion. But, you see, we are old-fashioned Scotch Presbyterians down in our village in South Carolina. I never was in a theater, and this is Good Friday. That's a fact, sure, said Phil thoughtfully. It never occurred to me. War is not exactly a spiritual stimulant, and it blurs the calendar. I believe we fight on Sundays oftener than on any other day. But I'm crazy to see the president since Ben's pardon. Mama will be here in a moment, and I'll ask her. You see, it's really an occasion, Phil went on. The people are all going there to see President Lincoln in the hour of his triumph, and his great general, fresh from the field of victory. Grant has just arrived in town. Mrs. Cameron entered and greeted Phil with motherly tenderness. Captain, you're so much like my boy. Had you noticed it, Margaret? Of course, Mama, but I was afraid I'd tire him with flattery if I tried to tell him. Only his hair is light and wavy, and Ben's straight and black, or you'd call them twins. Ben's a little taller. Excuse us, Captain Stoneman, but we've fallen so in love with your little sister, we feel we've known you all our lives. I assure you, Mrs. Cameron, your flattery is very sweet. Elsie and I do not remember our mother, and all this friendly criticism is more than welcome. Mama, Captain Stoneman asks me to go with him and his sister tonight to see the president at the theater. May I go? Will the president be there, Captain? Asked Mrs. Cameron. Yes, madam, with General and Mrs. Grant. It's really a great public function in celebration of peace and victory. Today the flag was raised over Fort Sumter, the anniversary of its surrender 4 years ago. The city will be illuminated. Then of course you can go. I will sit with Ben. I wish you to see the president. At 7 o'clock, Phil called for Margaret. They walked to the Capitol Hill and down Pennsylvania Avenue. The city was in a ferment. Vast crowds thronged the streets. In front of the hotel where General Grant stopped, the throng was so dense the streets were completely blocked. Soldiers, soldiers, soldiers at every turn, in squads, in companies, in regimental crowds, shouting cries of victory. The display of lights was dazzling in its splendor. Every building, in every street, in every nook and corner of the city, was lighted from attic to cellar. The public buildings and churches vied with each other in the magnificence of their decorations and splendor of illuminations. They turned a corner, and suddenly the Capitol, on the throne of its imperial hill, loomed a grand constellation in the heavens. Another look, and it seemed a huge bonfire against the background of the dark skies. Every window in its labyrinths of marble, from the massive base to its crowning statue of freedom, gleamed and flashed with light. More than 10,000 jets poured their rays through its windows, besides the innumerable lights that circled the mighty dome within and without. Margaret stopped, and Phil felt her soft hand grip his arm with sudden emotion. "Isn't it sublime?" she whispered. "Glorious," he echoed, but he was thinking of the pressure of her hand on his arm and the subtle tones of her voice. Somehow he felt that the light came from her eyes. He forgot the Capitol and the surging crowds before the sweeter creative wonder silently growing in his soul. "And yet," she faltered, "when I think of what all this means for our people at home, their sorrow and poverty and ruin, it makes me faint." Phil's hand timidly sought the soft one resting on his arm and touched it reverently. "Believe me, Miss Margaret, it will all be for the best in the end. The South will yet rise to a nobler life than she has ever lived in the past. This is her victory as well as ours." "I wish I could think so," she answered. They passed the City Hall and saw across its front, in giant letters of fire 30 feet deep, the words, "Union, Sherman, and Grant." On Pennsylvania Avenue, the hotels and stores had hung every window, awning, cornice, and swaying treetop with lanterns. The Grand Avenue was bridged by tricolored balloons floating and shimmering ghost-like far up in the dark sky. Above these, in the blacker zone toward the stars, the heavens were flashing sheets of chameleon flames from bursting rockets. Margaret had never dreamed such a spectacle. She walked in awed silence, now and then suppressing a sob for the memory of those she had loved and lost. A moment of bitterness would cloud her heart, and then, with the sense of Phil's nearness, his generous nature, the beauty and goodness of his sister, and all they owed to her for Ben's life, the cloud would pass. At every public building and in front of every great hotel, bands were playing. The wild war strains, floating skyward, seemed part of the changing scheme of light. The odor of burnt powder and smoldering rockets filled the warm spring air. The deep bay of the great fort guns now began to echo from every hilltop commanding the city, while 1,000 smaller guns barked and growled from every square and park and crossing. J. Cook and Company's banking house had stretched across its front in enormous blazing letters the words, "The Busy Bees, Balls, Ballots, and Bonds." Every telegraph and newspaper office was a roaring whirlpool of excitement, for the same scenes were being enacted in every center of the North. The whole city was now a fairy dream, its dirt and sin, shame and crime, all wrapped in glorious light. But above all other impressions was the contagion of the thunder shouts of hosts of men surging through the streets, the human roar with its animal and spiritual magnetism, wild, resistless, unlike any other force in the universe. Margaret's hand again and again unconsciously tightened its hold on Phil's arm, and he felt that the whole celebration had been gotten up for his benefit. They passed through a little park on their way to Ford's Theater on 10th Street, and the eye of the Southern girl was quick to note the budding flowers and full-blown lilacs. "See what an early spring!" she cried. "I know the flowers at home are gorgeous now." "I shall hope to see you among them some day when all the clouds have lifted," he said. She smiled and replied with simple earnestness, "A warm welcome will await your coming." And Phil resolved to lose no time in testing it. They turned into 10th Street, and in the middle of the block stood the plain 3-story brick structure of Ford's Theater, an enormous crowd surging about its 5 doorways and spreading out onto the sidewalk and half across the driveway. "Is that the theater?" asked Margaret. "Yes." "Why, it looks like a church without a steeple." "Exactly what it really is, Miss Margaret. It was a Baptist church. They turned it into a playhouse by remodeling its gallery into a dress circle and balcony and adding another gallery above. My grandmother Stoneman is a devoted Baptist, and she was an attendant at this church. My father never goes to church, but he used to go here occasionally to please her. Elsie and I frequently came." Phil pushed his way rapidly through the crowd with a peculiar sense of pleasure in making a way for Margaret and in defending her from the jostling throng. They found Elsie at the door, stamping her foot with impatience. "Well, I must say, Phil, this is prompt for a soldier who had positive orders," she cried. "I've been here an hour." "Nonsense, sis, I'm ahead of time," he protested. Elsie held up her watch. "It's 8:15. Every seat is filled, and they've stopped selling standing room. I hope you have good seats." "The best in the house tonight. The first row in the balcony dress circle, opposite the president's box. We can see everything on the stage, in the box, and every nook and corner of the house." "Then I'll forgive you for keeping me waiting." They ascended the stairs, pushed through the throng standing, and at last reached the seats. What a crowd! The building was a mass of throbbing humanity, and over all, the hum of the thrilling wonder of peace and victory. The women in magnificent costumes, officers in uniforms flashing with gold, the show of wealth and power, the perfume of flowers, and the music of violin and flutes gave Margaret the impression of a dream, so sharp was the contrast with her own life and people in the South. The interior of the house was a billow of red, white, and blue. The president's box was wrapped in two enormous silk flags with gold-fringed edges gracefully draped and hanging in festoons. Withers, the leader of the orchestra, was in high feather. He raised his baton with quick, inspired movement. It was for him a personal triumph, too. He had composed the music of a song for the occasion. It was dedicated to the president, and the program announced that it would be rendered during the evening between the acts by a famous quartet, assisted by the whole company in chorus. The national flag would be draped about each singer, worn as the togas of ancient Greece and Rome. It was already known by the crowd that General and Mrs. Grant had left the city for the North and could not be present, but every eye was fixed on the door through which the President and Mrs. Lincoln would enter. It was the hour of his supreme triumph. What a romance, his life! The thought of it thrilled the crowd as they waited. A few years ago this tall, sad-faced man had floated down the Sangamon River into a rough Illinois town, ragged, penniless, friendless, alone, begging for work. 4 years before he had entered Washington as President of the United States. But he came under cover of the night, with a handful of personal friends, amid universal contempt for his ability and the loud expressed conviction of his failure from within and without his party. He faced a divided nation and the most awful civil convulsion in history. Through it all he had led the nation in safety, growing each day in power and fame, until tonight, amid the victorious shouts of millions of a Union fixed in eternal granite, he stood forth the idol of the people, the first great American, the foremost man of the world. There was a stir at the door, and the tall figure suddenly loomed in view of the crowd. With one impulse they leapt to their feet, and shout after shout shook the building. The orchestra was playing "Hail to the Chief," but nobody heard it. They saw the chief. They were crying their own welcome in music that came from the rhythmic beat of human hearts. As the president walked along the aisle with Mrs. Lincoln, accompanied by Senator Harris's daughter and Major Rathbone, cheer after cheer burst from the crowd. He turned, his face beaming with pleasure, and bowed as he passed. The answer of the crowd shook the building to its foundations, and the president paused. His dark face flashed with emotion as he looked over the sea of cheering humanity. It was a moment of supreme exaltation. The people had grown to know and love and trust him, and it was sweet. His face, lit with the responsive fires of emotion, was transfigured. The soul seemed to separate itself from its dreamy, rugged dwelling place and flash its inspiration from the spirit world. As around this man's personality had gathered the agony and horror of war, so now about his head glowed and gleamed in imagination the splendors of victory. Margaret impulsively put her hand on Phil's arms. "Why, how Southern he looks! How tall and dark and typical his whole figure!" "Yes, and his traits of character even more typical," said Phil. "On the surface, easy, friendly ways and the tenderness of a woman, beneath an iron will and lion heart. I like him, and what always amazes me is his universality. A Southerner finds in him the South, the Western man the West. Even Charles Sumner from Boston almost loves him. You know, I think he is the first great all-round American who ever lived in the White House." The president's party had now entered the box, and as Mr. Lincoln took the armchair nearest the audience, in full view of every eye in the house, again the cheers rent the air. In vain Withers' baton flew, and the orchestra did its best. The music was drowned as in the roar of the sea. Again he rose and bowed and smiled, his face radiant with pleasure. The soul beneath those deep-cut lines had long pined for the sunlight. His love of the theater and the humorous story were the protest of his heart against pain and tragedy. He stood there bowing to the people, the grandest, gentlest figure of the fiercest war of human history, a man who was always doing merciful things stealthily as others do crimes. Little sunlight had come into his life, yet tonight he felt that the sun of a new day in his history and the history of the people was already tinging the horizon with glory. Back of those smiles, what a story! Many a night he had paced back and forth in the telegraph office of the War Department, read its awful news of defeat, and alone sat down and cried over the list of the dead. Many a black hour his soul had seen when the honors of earth were forgotten and his great heart throbbed on his sleeve. His character had grown so evenly and silently with the burdens he had borne, working mighty deeds with such little friction, he could not know, nor could the crowd to whom he bowed, how deep into the core of the people's life the love of him had grown. As he looked again over the surging crowd, his tall figure seemed to straighten, erect and buoyant, with the new dignity of conscious, triumphant leadership. He knew that he had come unto his own at last, and his brain was teeming with dreams of mercy and healing. The President resumed his seat. The tumult died away, and the play began amid a low hum of whispered comment directed at the flag-draped box. The actors struggled in vain to hold the attention of the audience until finally Hawk, the actor playing Dundreary, determined to catch their ear, paused and said, "Now that reminds me of a little story, as Mr. Lincoln says." Instantly the crowd burst into a storm of applause. The President laughed, leaned over and spoke to his wife, and the electric connection was made between the stage, the box, and the people. After this the play ran its smooth course, and the audience settled into its accustomed humor of sympathetic attention. In spite of the novelty of this, her first view of a theater, the President fascinated Margaret. She watched the changing lights and shadows of his sensitive face with untiring interest, and the wonder of his life grew upon her imagination. This man, who was the idol of the North, and yet to her so purely Southern, who had come out of the West, and yet was greater than the West or the North, and yet always supremely human. This man who sprang to his feet from the chair of state and bowed to a sorrowing woman with the deference of a knight. Every man's friend, good-natured, sensible, masterful and clear in intellect, strong yet modest, kind and gentle. Yes, he was more interesting than all the drama and romance of the stage. He held her imagination in a spell. Elsie, divining her abstraction, looked toward the President's box and saw approaching it along the balcony aisle the figure of John Wilkes Booth. "Look," she cried, touching Margaret's arm. "There's John Wilkes Booth, the actor. Isn't he handsome? They say he's in love with my chum, a senator's daughter whose father hates Mr. Lincoln with perfect fury." "He is handsome," Margaret answered, "but I'd be afraid of him with that raven hair and eyes shining like something wild." "They say he is wild and dissipated, yet half the silly girls in town are in love with him. He's as vain as a peacock." Booth, accustomed to free access to the theater, paused near the entrance to the box and looked deliberately over the great crowd, his magnetic face flushed with deep emotion, while his fiery, inspiring eyes glittered with excitement. Dressed in a suit of black broadcloth of faultless fit, from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, he was physically without blemish. A figure of perfect symmetry and proportion, his dark eyes flashing, his marble forehead crowned with curling black hair, agility and grace stamped on every line of his being. Beyond a doubt he was the handsomest man in America. A flutter of feminine excitement rippled the surface of the crowd in the balcony as his well-known figure caught the wandering eyes of the women. He turned and entered the door leading to the President's box, and Margaret once more gave her attention to the stage. Hawk, as Dundreary, was speaking his lines and looking directly at the President instead of at the audience. "Society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old woman, you darned old sock-dologing man-trap." Margaret winced at the coarse words, but the galleries burst into shouts of laughter that lingered in ripples and murmurs and shuffling of feet. The muffled crack of a pistol in the President's box hushed the laughter for an instant. No one realized what had happened, and when the assassin suddenly leaped from the box with a blood-marked knife flashing in his right hand, caught his foot in the flags, and fell to his knees on the stage, many thought it a part of the program, and a boy leaning over the gallery rail giggled. When Booth turned his face of statuesque beauty, lit by eyes flashing with insane desperation, and cried, "Sic semper tyrannis," they were only confirmed in this impression. A sudden piercing scream from Mrs. Lincoln, quivering, soul-harrowing. Leaning far out of the box, from ashen cheeks and lips leaped the piteous cry of appeal, her hand pointing to the retreating figure. "The President is shot! He has killed the President!" Every heart stood still for one awful moment. The brain refused to record the message. And then the storm burst. A wild roar of helpless fury and despair. Men hurled themselves over the footlights in vain pursuit of the assassin. Already the clatter of his horse's feet could be heard in the distance. A surgeon threw himself against the door of the box, but it had been barred within by the cunning hand. Another leaped on the stage, and the people lifted him up in their arms and over the fatal railing. Women began to faint, and strong men trampled down the weak and mad rushes from side to side. The stage, in a moment, was a seething mass of crazed men, among them the actors and actresses in costume and painted faces, their mortal terror shining through the rouge. They passed water up to the box, and some tried to climb up and enter it. The 200 soldiers of the President's Guard suddenly burst in, and amid screams and groans of the weak and injured, stormed the house with fixed bayonets, cursing, yelling, and shouting at the top of their voices. Clear out, you sons of hell!" One of them suddenly bore down with fixed bayonet toward Phil. Margaret shrank in terror close to his side and tremblingly held his arm. Elsie sprang forward, her face aflame, her eyes flashing fire, her little figure tense, erect, and quivering with rage. "How dare you, idiot! Brute!" The soldier, brought to his senses, saw Phil in full captain's uniform before him, and suddenly drew himself up, saluting. Phil ordered him to guard Margaret and Elsie for a moment, drew his sword, leaped between the crazed soldiers and their victims, and stopped their insane rush. Within the box the great head lay in the surgeon's arms, the blood slowly dripping down, and the tiny death bubbles forming on the kindly lips. They carried him tenderly out, and another group bore after him the unconscious wife. The people tore the seats from their fastenings and heaped them in piles to make way for the precious burdens. As Phil pressed forward with Margaret and Elsie, through the open door came the roar of the mob without, shouting its cries. "The President is shot! Seward is murdered! Where is Grant? Where is Stanton? To arms! To arms!" The peal of signal guns could now be heard, the roll of drums and the hurried tramp of soldiers' feet. They marched none too soon. The mob had attacked the stockade holding 10,000 unarmed Confederate prisoners. At the corner of the block in which the theater stood, they seized a man who looked like a Southerner and hung him to the lamp-post. 2 heroic policemen fought their way to his side and rescued him. If the temper of the people during the war had been convulsive, now it was insane, with one mad impulse and one thought: vengeance. Horror, anger, terror, uncertainty, each passion fanned the one animal instinct into fury. Through this awful night, with the lights still gleaming as if to mock the celebration of victory, the crowds swayed in impotent rage through the streets, while the telegraph bore on the wings of lightning the awe-inspiring news. Men caught it from the wires and stood in silent groups, weeping, and their wrath against the fallen South began to rise as the moaning of the sea under a coming storm. At dawn, black clouds hung threatening on the eastern horizon as the sun rose, tinging them for a moment with scarlet and purple glory. Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. Even grim Stanton, the iron-hearted, stood by his bedside and through blinding tears exclaimed, "Now he belongs to the ages." The deed was done. The wheel of things had moved. Vice President Johnson took the oath of office, and men hailed him chief. But the seat of empire had moved from the White House to a little dark house on the Capitol Hill, where dwelt an old club-footed man, alone, attended by a strange brown woman of sinister animal beauty and the restless eyes of a leopardess. End of Book 1, Chapter 6.